can get that done. Anyway, welcome to Brainstorm. Breakthroughs in brain research, an informative discussion with a group of accomplished UCLA faculty from the Department of Psychology. This event has been an exciting collaboration between Women in Philanthropy and the UCLA Department of Psychology. And I believe that there's information about what the program is on your seats. That's what it says on my thing, but did anybody get that? Okay. Well, all right. We'll figure out what that was all about. Maybe it's something you get when you leave. But anyway, hello. I'm Naomi Ellison, and I am president of Women in Philanthropy. And it's been an honor to be chosen to do that. Women in Philanthropy at UCLA celebrates and inspires women's giving across the UCLA campus and fosters women's participation on campus boards and volunteer leadership positions. The group celebrated its 20th anniversary in 2014. It now boasts over 2,000 members who contribute time, talent, and treasure to every corner of the campus. These extraordinary women leaders have roles on many of the advisory leadership groups here at UCLA and also hold positions within the UCLA Foundation. Tonight's program should be very enlightening and informative. UCLA faculty and students are on the brink of historic breakthroughs on the most complex and least understood organ of the body. Through the use of the latest technology, the top-ranked UCLA Department of Psychology is studying all aspects of brain functioning. We are looking forward to a lively discussion with a panel of our renowned psychology faculty to learn about their groundbreaking brain research. So I would like to introduce to you the moderator for our presentation tonight, Dean Victoria Sork. Victoria Sork, a renowned plant evolutionary biologist, has served as Dean of Life Sciences Division in the College of Letters and Science since 2019. She has also served as Senior Associate... 2009. All right. But thank you. You know, it's probably being recorded. You know, but this is sci-fi, right? She has also served as Senior Associate Dean at the David Geffen School of Medicine from 2004 to 2009. Professor Sork chaired UCLA's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, where she has been on faculty in this department and the Institute of Environment and Sustainability since 2002. Elected in 2004, as a fellow in the American Association for the Advancement of Science, she has conducted pioneer research in the field of landscape genomics, which integrates genomics, evolutionary biology, and conservation science. She is particularly concerned with the ecological and genetic processes that will determine whether California oaks will tolerate climate change. And any of you that are from Northern California know that we have to keep our California oaks. A native of Los Angeles, she holds a PhD in biological sciences from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She earned a BS in biological sciences with honors from the University of California, Irvine. Please help me give a warm Women in Philanthropy welcome to Dean Victoria Sork.
So I will repeat my thank you, Naomi, because I want everyone to hear it. We're so grateful for all that you do for UCLA and the Women in Philanthropy and the other services that you've done over the years. So you really are a wonderful, wonderful volunteer leader that makes a big difference. I also want to thank all of the members of Women in Philanthropy. This is really a very important organization, and your interest and commitment to UCLA means a lot across the campus. I want to say that you're very, very fortunate to hear these 5 amazing women psychologists speak on a range of topics related to brain science. And the college is very, very committed to educating the next generation of scholars, both through their top-rated graduate programs and their top-rated undergraduate programs. This is the largest major on campus. We have something like over 3,000 students that are majoring in psychology. But I want to say is one of the reasons that psychology can be such a wonderful department is that we are in a campus where neuroscience is absolutely astounding. Throughout the School of Medicine and Semel and the college, we are taking care of research, training the next generation, coming up with new innovations, translating it to clinical, dealing with it. So this is why UCLA as a whole is really is known worldwide for its contributions at every level of the neurosciences. Today what you're going to see is the research that is going on in the psychology department, which is rather impressive. And in some ways you're going to get frustrated because they're going to go 5 minutes each, and they've been told they can only get, in every topic you're going to want more. So afterwards I'm going to ask the panel a few questions, but then I'll open it up for your inquiries. If you don't get your questions in during all of this, which we will not let go more than the assigned time, I think we have to get done within an hour, there'll be time afterwards to meet with everybody. So thank you for coming, and I'm going to introduce the panel, and then I will not say much until they've all spoken their word, and then I'll address a few questions. So first, to my right is Naomi Eisenbergers. She's a professor in an area of psychology called social psychology. Her work has been recognized with numerous awards, early career awards from the American Psychological Association, the American Psychosomatic Society, and the Association for Psychological Sciences. And what she focuses on is relationships, and relationships between the brain and how they affect us and how our relationships affect the brain. I will just say I was talking with a friend the other day about her research. She has a science paper that's already gotten about 3,000 citations. So some of the work she's done is really been noticed. Alicia Izquierda joined us a few years ago. She's now an associate professor in behavioral neuroscience, another subfield of psychology, interested in the area of learning behavior. She's an assistant director in the Brain Research Institute, and she's also chapter president for the Society of Neuroscience. She's received the Faculty Mentor Award from the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, and she was elected a Kavli Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences. Her research focuses on decision-making and the impact of environmental factors of being able to make decisions. Then further to my right is Professor Vicki Mays. She's in clinical psychology, and her research focuses on underserved communities. But what is particularly unique about Vicki's research is the integration of social psychology theory with clinical psychology and community health. And so her research spans all the way to the fundamentals of how do we understand discrimination to how do we set policy to prevent future problems. Then we go on to, Jennifer Silvers, who's an assistant professor. So you're going to see at every level, this generations of students and research is not going to suffer from any gap. Jennifer is in developmental psychology. She's recognized, she's been recognized for the Neuroscience Society, and her own research focuses on children and emotions. And then finally to my right, another assistant professor, but she's been here a little bit longer than Jennifer, Janet Tomiyama, and she's in health psychology. And UCLA has one of the top health psychology programs in the country, and I think that's because of the wonderful collaborative spirit we have between our scientists that can take advantage of the strong health sciences on campus. But she's been doing very cutting-edge research and has received an early career professional award, a distinguished faculty teaching award, and her research focuses on eating and stress. So you've now got introduction to the panel, and we will start with Naomi, and they will just give you an overview from their work and continue down the line.
Great. So I'm Naomi Eisenberger, another Naomi, and I'm a social neuroscientist. And what that means is I use different kinds of neuroimaging methods to try to understand how our brains process different kinds of social experiences. And in my lab, one of the things that we tend to focus on are some of the basic emotional experiences that arise in our closest social relationships. So we ask questions like, why does rejection hurt? Or why does it warm our hearts to feel connected to other people? And then we use neuroimaging methods, things like fMRI, to try to answer some of these questions. So for the past several years, one of the things that we've been curious about is why rejection hurts. And I think we all sort of know this. We know that we've had experiences of rejection or exclusion, or sometimes just losing somebody close to us that we know feel very unpleasant. And we know that we use physical pain words to describe these experiences. We talk about hurt feelings. We talk about broken hearts. And in fact, some research has shown that if you ask people, what's the worst experience of your life? About 75% of people will pick a social experience, something like a relationship breakup or the loss of a loved one. But why is this? Why is it that these experiences like rejection, why do they actually hurt? And so in our lab, we've set out to test this. And in an early study, in some of our work, one way that we've done this is by bringing people into the fMRI scanner and then excluding them. And we do this with a little task that we call cyberball. So in these studies, subjects come in, we put them in the fMRI scanner, and they're told that they're going to be playing this little virtual ball tossing game with two other people. So you can see the subject's hand at the bottom of the screen here, and they think they're playing with these two other people. Now, of course, in reality, this is all rigged. So this is all computer controlled, and we've set it so that at a certain point in time, these two computer players stop throwing the ball to our subjects. And so at this very moment, we can look and see what's more active in the brain when subjects are being excluded compared to when they were being included just moments before. And what we tend to see in these studies is that the brain regions that are active during social exclusion, experience that we've now been calling social pain, look very similar to the regions that are activated when people are feeling physical pain. So in the brain, there seems to be some overlap in the way that it processes physical painful experiences and socially painful experiences. And we've gone on to sort of develop this theory, physical social pain overlap theory, that looks at this. And the idea is that because social relationships are so important for our survival as humans, our brains may have evolved such that they borrowed this physical pain signal to highlight not only damage to our physical body, but also damage to our social relationships. So the idea is that if being socially separated from others actually feels painful, then we may be motivated to avoid social separation and maintain social connection, which is really important. And we've tried to test this theory in different ways. So one more recent way that we've looked at this is by seeing if a drug that we know affects physical pain, if it can also actually affect social pain. So we gave people Tylenol, which we all know is a physical painkiller, and we wanted to see could it also change people's feelings of social pain. In one study, we gave people Tylenol every day for 3 weeks, and each evening we asked them to record their hurt feelings. What we found is that subjects who had been taking Tylenol actually showed a reduction in their self-reported hurt feelings over time, whereas the placebo subjects showed no change. In a second study, we did something similar, again, brought people in, gave them Tylenol for 3 weeks. This time, though, at the end of the 3-week period, we had them go through that same cyberball exclusion task that I just showed you. And once again, it was the Tylenol subjects that were showing less physical pain-related neural activity in the brain. So from this together, we see that there seems to be some kind of overlap in the way that our brains process physical and social pain, and it shows how we can use the brain to understand some of these basic questions that we have about social experience, like why rejection hurts. So that's a little bit about my research.
Good. Thank you, Naomi. Okay, Alicia, help.
All right, hi everyone. Can everyone hear me? So I'm Alicia Izquierdo. I'm a behavioral neuroscientist, and my area of research. Better? And my area of research is on the brain mechanisms of value, preference, and particularly how we make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So I'm showing you here sort of a diagram of sort of the general idea of my area of research is how the brain calculates cost and benefit and how it then determines value. So we know that there are several costs involved to make decisions and get reward. And I'm particularly interested in studying these costs. So the one that you might be very privy to every day is the time cost. For example, to get the unicorn frappuccino, you have to wait in line at Starbucks to get that unicorn frappuccino. Now, if you wanted to wait 0 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, that would tell me a little bit about how much you value that unicorn frappuccino. Now, another cost that we study is an effort cost. And I'm just giving you a simple example here of enduring the physical effort of reaching a goal. So just as an example would be to climb the top of the mountain to then feel a personal sense of satisfaction. So that's a different kind of reward, that personal sense of satisfaction, to then the example that I gave you with the time. But nevertheless, it's a reward that you've endured or that you've paid some kind of cost to acquire. Now, one that is particularly of interest to us is this risk cost. And I'm showing you an example that unfortunately is too common these days, is enduring some kind of risk to your own safety or the safety of others to update a Facebook status, as an example. Now, a very related cost is this uncertainty cost, and it's more of a state rather than a cost. So we know that there are individuals that are more at ease in Las Vegas. So there's almost this sort of comfort in the lose big, win big state. And there are some people that just are not comfortable in that state and much prefer sort of these more stable, certain outcomes, these very predictable outcomes. And so what we're particularly interested in is how the brain computes all of these costs in sort of the normal brain, but also what happens in pathology. So in particular, we're interested in how addiction affects these kinds of decision-making processes. So for example, with the transition from recreational use to more compulsive drug use, one undergoes a lot of changes to the brain. There are a lot of neuroadaptations to the brain, and these actually can be seen in poor decision making. So people seem to lack insight into their own behavior and make very poor choices. In fact, risky behavior goes up. You have increase in sort of the value of that drug reward at the expense of other possible rewards. And so we're very interested in both the normal condition and also the pathological condition when these neuroadaptations have taken place. Now, this is just to demonstrate here that it might surprise you to know that many of the brain regions and the neurotransmitter systems and the brain chemicals that support this type of choice are actually very similar across species, across mammals. So you actually have similarities in the rat brain and in the monkey brain to the human brain in how the brain solves these kinds of choices. Of course, you can see here, as illustrated, is the complexity of this type of decision obviously is different across species, with the most complex type of decision in the human. But we have now in neuroscience really an unprecedented ability to genetically target cells within these brain regions, turn them on and turn them off, and even track cells within the same brain region to see how they interact with other brain regions. And we also, and we also are part of the systems neuroscientists are now part of a burgeoning field that are interacting with artificial intelligence and machine learning and brain-computer interface to really use this artificial intelligence to decode brain signals to then actually predict choices before they happen. And so with that, I'd just like to thank my wonderful undergraduates and graduate students who are equally as invested in these types of questions as I am, and all of you for coming.
Thanks. Being the senior person up here, I'm doing old school, which is the podium. So as the dean says, you see the whole range. First of all, I really want to thank the organizers for having me here. I really appreciate it. Because one of the things that I'm really interested in is science that has a purpose, science that is for change, not just science for discovery. So as the dean pointed out, I'm by training a clinical psychologist. So early in my career, I'm very interested in helping people one by one or helping families. But then I went back and I also got trained in health policy. And what I'm interested in is really science for change. So let me talk a little bit about my research and the time that I have. And I'm going to start by talking about the 2 R's. And it used to be when we said the 2 R's, we were talking about reading and writing. But instead, the 2 R's are going to be something different and sometimes a little difficult to talk about, but given what we have going on in society today, is really important. I want to talk about race and race-based discrimination. In a lot of my work, in terms of talking about race and race-based discrimination, it's particularly salient now. Many of you may be aware that we are commemorating the 25th anniversary of the civil disturbance with Rodney King. And 25 years later, when you turn on the news, when you get the feeds and what have you, what you're seeing are some of the same events. People who have been treated either from their perception unfairly, differently, badly, are reacting to it. But one of the things that happens for many people is they don't understand, why did that person react to me the way that they did? Why is something that I said really upset that person? When I first started my career and I was trying to study race and race-based discrimination, one of the big mistakes I made is I started with the emotions. And that's really been the way we characterize often race-based discrimination, is somebody is upset. And in essence, what we were doing is really focusing on a lot of the research that social psychology had given us, which said that, some people are in group, some people are out group, some people are very upset by this, but it was a victimization orientation that I decided I didn't want to do anymore. So what you see here in my slide is that if I started with emotions, you can see the stressor on the side, and there's research, some of mine and others, that says racism, the experience of being treated badly or differently, is actually a stressor. And when you think about that stressor, there are emotional responses, there are physiological responses, and one of the things that helps you to answer why there's such health disparities is that emotion that goes to a physiological reaction then turns itself into often chronic diseases. Part of what I realized, and Naomi was helpful, and some of my colleagues, it's wonderful to be a psychologist in life sciences where you have neuroscience there. I began to realize that the key is really the brain. How people appraise what happens to them, how it is that you perceive or I perceive a behavior that happens. So in one of the studies that we've done just recently, we actually looked at this in African American women, and we gave them a task, and that task made them recall, for example, a lot of experiences of discrimination. And then we gave them a very complex cognitive task to do. And what did we see? We saw that for those women, they were less likely to be able to plan, execute, remember, and kind of operate at kind of an executive level of functioning. So part of when we see, for example, sometimes kids in schools and they're poorly performing, sometimes that poor performance has a lot to do with what they feel like in that classroom. And part of our job is to try and create classrooms, as UCLA often tries to do, that help the students to optimize the best of their ability. And another study that we're currently working on, part of what we've also looked at is this whole notion with young Latino and African American men who have been frisked by police.
that, you know, that we've seen several shootings and what have you. We always say, but somebody didn't do something. What happened? Well, what we find is that previous experiences in which people feel they've been treated badly or unfairly really results in them having a memory that when that experience is about to happen again, as you can see up at the top of the slide, it's a sense of threat. And that threat causes them to behave in a way in which they feel like sometimes their life might be at survival. So the two things that we've been trying to do is to not just look at those individuals who are the recipients of discrimination, but also what we want to do is to start to develop the science of the perpetrators of discrimination. Because much like the focus that we have currently on bullying, where we can begin to identify some of the characteristics that really say this person's likely to engage in a set of behaviors that are going to result in someone being treated badly, we think in terms of our science that we're beginning to identify those. And if we can, then what it means is that we can intervene early, and what it means is that we do not have to keep celebrating big riots and some of the, you know, terrible events that we've experienced in society. Thank you.
Thank you. So as the most junior member of this panel, I'm thrilled to be here. I just celebrated my 1-year anniversary at UCLA, and thank you. Nobody else clapped for me about that before, but and really each day I'm just consistently in awe of getting to come to work at such a fantastic institution. So in my laboratory, we study the brain bases of social and emotional development in children and adolescents. And the reason that we focus on childhood and adolescence is not just because we care about making happy and healthy kids who are likely to be resilient in the face of stressors and temptations. We also care about childhood and adolescence because these are really sensitive periods for setting up somebody's trajectory for the rest of their lives. 14 years of age is the peak age of onset for all mental illness. So we know something really formative is happening in those first 2 decades of life with regards to how the brain is set up and what that will do to carry a person forward in the future. So in my lab, briefly speaking, we focus on 2 different areas of research. First, we try to understand how it is that children and teens learn to regulate their emotions and impulses. So basically figuring out what tools we can give a person to try to manage themselves in emotionally hot situations. And then secondly, we look at how social environments may influence emotional development. And just to give you a greater flavor for that, I'll tell you about 2 lines of work that we're currently conducting to try to address this second point. Now, for any of you who have ever had a parent or have ever been a parent, you know that parents are pretty important for setting up someone's social environment. And that's because parents do a lot more than just keep us safe, keep us well-fed, keep us warm when it's cold and cold when it's warm. They indeed can be thought of as really our social and emotional tutors for teaching us a lot about how to interact with our environments. What's something to approach? What's something to avoid? How do I determine what's dangerous and what's safe in the environment? So with this logic in mind, we recently conducted a study to see whether children may learn to a greater extent when they're observing their parents exhibit fear, as opposed to an adult that they're not familiar with. So to try to model this in a laboratory setting, we brought parents into the lab. They thought they were there just to drop their kids off, and then they quickly learned that was not the case. So we had parents come into the lab, and we videotaped them while they engaged in this computer task. So this is an example of a parent here. She's looking at different shapes on a computer, and every now and then, whenever she sees a pink circle, she hears this terrible, terrible noise that sounds like nails on a chalkboard. Eventually, she comes to dislike this pink circle quite a bit because each time she sees it, something bad happens. What we were interested in here was not how this mother came to learn about the pink circle, but whether her child may preferentially learn from watching her mom exhibit fear behavior as opposed to someone else. Indeed, when we look at children's self-report, we find that they are reporting greater dislike for the pink circle in this case when it's their parent who's modeling fear behavior as opposed to someone else. And when we look in the brain, we see that this is supported by brain circuitry that's typically important for allowing you to learn through your own firsthand experiences. So what this tells us is that parents can almost be a teacher for their children, that they can be an agent by proxy of teaching them about what's something to fear versus what's something to see as safe in the environment. So given what we see here about how important parents are, we next wanted to examine what happens for children who don't have parents early on in development. Now, given that we're members of a social species, something that Naomi spoke very eloquently about, it really matters to us that we have strong social connections. And at no point in the lifespan is this more important than during the first few years of life. We come into this world with the expectation that somebody is going to be looking out for us and caregiving, providing us with caregiving. So to examine what the effects are of not receiving caregiving in those first crucial years, we compared children who'd been raised from birth by their biological parents to children who were in international orphanage care for the first 2 years of life before being adopted. And we wanted to see whether those early experiences may play a role in their subsequent brain development in the way that they learn about fears. So to do this, we compared these two groups of individuals as they completed a fear learning task. It's very similar to what I told you before, only now they're playing the task basically that the parents did before rather than watching a video of someone else doing it. So they're seeing a pink circle and every now and then they hear this awful noise. What we found that was really interesting is that those individuals who had been in orphanage care for the first 2 years of their life were showing accelerated brain development, specifically in brain regions that allow you to learn about threats. It seems as though their brain is literally speeding up in its ability to detect and respond to potential threats or stressors in the environment. This might be coming at a cost or as a trade-off for development in other brain regions, and that's something we're currently investigating. But what was really interesting is that while this is an atypical kind of pattern of brain response that we're seeing here, it's developmentally unusual to see, it seems to be protective. That is, among the kids who were in orphanage care early on, those whose brain looked the most different from their same age peers are the ones who are showing the least anxiety. So it seems as though this is not just evidence of the brain going awry after experiencing this early life stressor, but rather it might be an adaptation that's helping to confer resilience in the face of stress. So we're currently following up with these kids now that they're in adolescence to try and see what happens down the road and whether we can try to draw from these naturally existing individual differences to maybe teach kids who have experienced early life stress to be more resilient in the face of such challenges in the future. So that's just a snapshot for you.
Okay, so will you please raise your hand if you are a stress eater? You eat more during times of stress. Will you shout out some of your comfort foods to me? Chocolate, pasta, I think chips, bread, French fries, ice cream. Mine is chips and dip personally. So in my lab, I study stress and eating and how these two things interact. And as you might imagine, they interact a lot, and a lot of that starts in the brain. And so I wanted to tell you first what we know currently about stress and food and eating in the brain. And so the first thing that stress does is it really sort of turns on and revs up the reward circuitry in your brain that Alicia was talking about. And it makes you really start to crave especially sweet and fatty foods. So someone mentioned chocolate, ice cream is another big comfort food. And at the same time that this happens, the parts of your brain that are responsible for controlling your behavior or controlling your eating behavior, stress actually shuts that down, and that's the prefrontal cortex, which you may have heard about in the past. And then there's this sort of insidious side thing that happens, which is that stress sort of pushes everything that you're doing into habit territory. So you may have experienced this where you just realize you grabbed another handful of M&Ms without even realizing it or consciously doing it. That's because stress helps your brain encode the eating that you're doing in the basal ganglia, which is the home of habit in the brain. So all these things are conspiring to make you eat less healthy during stress, but at the same time, in turn, that brownie that you eat actually gives you a hit of dopamine in the brain. And that's, as you know, the feel-good drug. And that's why it feels so good to eat a delicious ice cream sundae. It literally is making your brain secrete these chemicals, these neurotransmitters. And then, if that weren't enough, Eating this type of sugary, fatty food also then actually works to comfort you. So it tends to feed back and dampen the stress circuitry in your brain. At least that's true of rodents and some non-human primate species. We think also it's happening in humans. Some recent work from my lab shows that the people who are doing comfort eating actually show dampened physiological levels of stress in their body. And so there's a reason why we do this comfort eating. And so I'm the director of the Dieting, Stress, and Health Lab here. And so you might be wondering, well, as long as I go on a diet, I'll be okay. I won't fall prey to these processes. But really rigid, restrictive dieting tends to be like leaving around kindling in your brain or like dry California grasses all over the place. And so when this cycle starts to hit, it really just revs up and speeds up and intensifies this whole process of stress eating. And so that's why you tend to reach for chocolate when you are stressed out. And so I wanted to just briefly talk about some directions we're going in my lab as it pertains to the brain. And so not all of us have access to an fMRI scanner. I don't in my home. And so what we've tried to do is create tools that everybody could use to kind of understand where they sit on this continuum of eating for these reward-related sort of addictive-like purposes. So it's just a 9-item questionnaire that you can get at my website, dishlab.org, and you can take it and it'll tell you where you are from not at all food addicted to, oh no, you might be a food addict. So you can check that out for yourself. We're also, with colleagues, trying to figure out the brain pathways that are involved when you experience a food craving. So we do really fun studies, well, for us, not for the participants, where we make people not eat their most craved food for a couple weeks, and we see what happens to their brain. And it's really interesting to me. So your brain responds very actively to delicious foods like brownies and ice cream and French fries and things. But it responds in a different way to your most craved food. So your brain has a very nuanced and complicated way that it's responding to all these different foods that you're eating. So not all foods are created equal. And then finally, we're trying to see whether or not we can sort of hijack these brain processes to make people healthier. And so this is with my graduate student, Jenna Cummings, where we're hypothesizing that if this sort of yummy food is occupying these reward pathways in your brain, then maybe there's a sort of no vacancy kind of thing happening where some other rewarding substance, like for example, alcohol, can't simultaneously activate your brain. So maybe there's sort of a competition that's happening in your brain. And so what we're doing in a study that's currently ongoing is we're bringing in people who are at risk for alcoholism, and we give them these really delicious, high-fat, high-sugar foods to see if that might then subsequently dampen down their alcohol cravings. And so that study's still ongoing, so if you want to find out, I'm sure once it's published, we'll put it up on the website. But if you want to hear about any of my other work, it's dishlab.org. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask this amazing group of scientists a few questions about general questions, and then after we have a few comments here, we'll open up to whatever questions you might want to ask. But I have to say that as Dean of Life Sciences, I'm really proud to have life psychology in life sciences. Usually people think of us being only biological departments, and this decision was made 50 or 60 years ago. And when you think about the foresight of being for this department to be in the life sciences instead of being in the social sciences, I have to wonder how it's contributed. I'd love to hope that it has contributed to the fact that they are so highly ranked and that they've been able to immediately and perhaps out in front of everybody incorporate brain science, biological processes into their research. I mean, I'm sure many of you, when you took psychology classes, it was with very little biological explanations, right? It was more about behavior. So what I want to ask a few of the panelists who feel like answering it, to what extent has being able to incorporate brain science into your research, every one of you talked about using the brain, but maybe you can talk about how your particular field has changed and what do you think being able to understand the brain and incorporate research on that looks at it changes the field of psychology that you're in. Does anyone want to try to tackle this?
Sure, I'm happy to tackle it.
Yeah.
So health psychology is the subfield that I'm in, and it's actually one of the very newest fields of psychology, and it's based on the sort of what you might consider a magical premise, which is the way that you think and feel can actually change your biology. It seems crazy and magical, but I think it's a perfect fit that psychology is in life sciences because it's so easy. People are already on board with the fact that the brain connects to the body, and you can see, so if I'm stressed out, the levels of the stress hormone cortisol increase. And so I think when you see something as sort of fluffy as social pain actually showing up as biological signatures in the body, I think that's both really cool and important, and something that you could only really get with this integration in life sciences.
Anyone else can talk about how their subdiscipline has changed as a result of incorporating brain science into the questions your subfield is asked?
Comment on that. You know, it's been fascinating for me to see the difference in how work in the area of diversity is received when you begin to talk about the brain. It's very hard, you know, to some extent to talk about some of the difficult aspects of race and racism. But when we take it away from personal feelings, blaming people should have behaved differently, and begin to talk about it within the context of, you know, there is a process that happened that led you to be this way. And there's also a process potentially, that's where my clinical psychology comes in, that can help you to behave differently. So I think the doors have been opened much more to have a broader audience realize that they can participate in this, they can change, and that the topic is one that is a topic to be discussed in general company as opposed to, you know, kind of keeping it very narrowly discussed.
Go ahead.
So, building on what both of you guys just said, one thing that I've seen that has been a change in social psychology as a function of integrating brain science is just sort of legitimizing some of the things that maybe we already knew as humans. So, I think we all kind of know that rejection is painful, but seeing that the brain responds to rejection in a way that looks very similar to physical pain can sometimes change how seriously people take that experience. And that is one thing that is nice, because I think whereas people tend to take other people's physical pain experiences very seriously, for whatever reason, we're more easily able to dismiss people's socially painful experiences. And so having the brain as sort of evidence to back up, this is actually, processed in a way that's very similar to physical pain, which we're sympathetic to, is helpful.
Go ahead.
Just one other comment to add is that I think brain imaging, in particular in humans, has really given us insight into child and adolescent development in a way that was never before possible. So if you look at textbooks from 30 years ago, there are often references to the human brain not changing after the age of 5. We now know that the human brain is changing, and I'm dead serious. We now know that the human brain is changing throughout the lifespan, but really it's continuing to develop until 25. And this has important implications not just for our understanding of the brain and of human behavior, but also from a policy perspective. It's been instrumental in changing things like how we approach juvenile justice. So I think that what's remarkable about looking at brain science is the way that it can shape not only our basic understanding of psychological processes, which is important for all of us up here, but really also for shaping real-world consequences that impact us all.
So I'm going to ask 2 more general questions and then get the audience. The 2 general questions I would ask. First of all, UCLA has a lot of students, and psychology has a lot of majors. Almost all of you, I believe, have undergraduates working in your laboratories. How do you think it changes your research to have undergraduates there, and what do you think it changes the undergraduates to have them involved in the research? Does anyone want to talk about that undergraduate?
I'd certainly like to tackle that question. So I do have a fair amount of undergrads in my lab, and I think they contribute an openness that sometimes at the professor level you tend to get a little more narrow in terms of your research focus, and the undergrads provide that sort of open-mindedness and this creativity about the brain, about questions about the brain. And there's a new training for the undergrads these days. So this beautiful concept of neuroplasticity that has been mentioned actually by a couple of the panelists here, this idea that experience changes the brain. Not just that the brain functions to override all of your behavioral experiences, right? That you actually take in these experiences and it shapes your brain. That is a training that undergrads just intuitively now have through their classes, and there's a reason why psychobiology and neuroscience majors are so popular. It's because this is a really interesting concept.
Any other comments on? Okay, I'm going to give you a tougher question, and this will be. It seems appropriate for women in philanthropy to talk about the gender issue or the gender ratios that we have on campus. I know in life sciences, women on the faculty tend to be around 30-35%. In other areas of science, you can have as few as 5%. Now, I want to say psychology has about 70 faculty, and these are not the only women that are on the faculty. But you know, motivating more women to get into science fields, and certainly our fields have gotten more influenced by science. Maybe you can talk as a little bit, or one or two can comment. What does it matter to bring in, you know, obviously equal opportunity, but in terms of scholarship and voice and perspective, how do you think having more women involved in science, involved in scholarship, changes what we learn? Go ahead, Jen, I'll let you start.
So I think similarly to what Alicia was just saying about how undergraduates provide this broader perspective or new perspective sometimes when you're in a lab, the same is true with having a diversity of voices and minds in any discipline can only enhance that discipline. And it's really critical that we don't limit ourselves to only picking from, you know, half the population, for example. So I think that one of the most simple ways in which having women is important for scholarship is just that it's going to be a different set of perspectives and voices that is going to ultimately lead to more creativity, more innovation, and really greater insight.
Naomi.
So I think it's really important to have women faculty like these lovely ladies here as role models. So one thing that I get the honor of doing every other year is I get to teach the honors thesis students. So these are all the top students in psychology who are doing a research project with a faculty member. Last year my class was almost all women, which is great. There was one guy, I think. But on the very last day of class, they all sort of, I think the guy wasn't there that day, and they all raised their hands and they're like, could you just talk about, you know, how are you a professor and you still have a family, and how do you do all those things? So I think it's great to have women in the field as role models for these, you know, young women who are coming in who maybe don't think of a professor as a woman and are trying to figure that out.
So I will just add, I think that seeing how bringing more women involved in science, more women involved as professors is changing, you know, the questions we ask and how we educate. I think also increasing the diversity across the board in our faculty is extremely important. And so in life sciences, we go out of our way to make sure that our undergraduates, we promote diversity, promote students that traditionally are not thought of as scientists, and make sure they stay. So this notion of bringing a voice, it's not only beneficial to them, but it's beneficial to scholarship that we have everybody at the table. So those are some general themes and I was given, but I think that you probably are just now popping over with your follow-up questions. So I hope you took some notes, and I will, there is people here with mics, which will mean that I don't have to repeat your question. So, but I will try to move it around. So does anyone want to raise their hand and this woman here, can you get the mic to her? And then what we'll do is, can you give the mic to this woman here so that after we get one question, we're ready with the second?
Hi, I'd like to address this with the professor that works with the adolescents and the teenagers. Since so many young people are smoking pot today, I'm curious, since you say the brain is changing all the way up to the 20s, at least, what are they factually finding out about the effect of pot smoking from people who are 12, 13, 11? I don't know how early it starts, but is it factually affecting their brain in a negative way?
That's a great question. So what I can tell you is that there's a lot of interest right now in trying to address that question in a really thorough way. So right now, the National Institutes of Health have funded the first study of its kind that's going to be a 10-year-long study looking at children starting at age 10 till they're 20 to try to test them before they begin using drugs and substances of all kinds, to really get at this question and to look at the same individuals as their brain developed over the course of 10 years. To date, most of the research we've had has looked at people who are, say, in late adolescence or in their 20s, some of whom are heavy marijuana users and some of whom are not, and there are differences. But we don't know whether that's because one group used marijuana and one group did not, or rather that those differences were there to begin with, and that's what led one group to use and one group not to. So this current study that's being funded by NIH is going to really open up, I think, it's going to address a lot of these open questions for us to be able to see with more definitive evidence what people's brains look like before and after use, and to be able to compare within an individual what those trajectories are like. There are some studies that suggest that, for example, early marijuana use might be associated with slightly higher rates of schizophrenia, for example. But the vast majority of people who use substances like marijuana don't go on to develop mental health problems, thankfully. So it's a question, though, of understanding why some people seem to respond in that way and others don't.
Okay.
Hi. This is really interesting. Thanks. My question is, could you do, if you were doing the social pain work, could you do the sorts of things that are connected to race, the kind of social pain? Yeah, so if you just change, not have them toss the ball back and forth, but have an ethnic slur or something. Is your hypothesis that it would be that same area in the brain?
Yeah, so Vicki and I collaborated on a study a little while ago where we looked at this kind of question, and that was our original hypothesis. What we saw looked a little bit different. So the study, if we had a lot more money, we could have done it in a lot of different ways. What happened here is that African American subjects came into the scanner, and they were excluded by supposed white participants. And we asked them about their feelings of, distress, how upset they were, and how much they thought they were excluded because of race or some other factor. And essentially what we found is that to the extent that people said they thought they were excluded because of their race, they actually showed less pain-related activity. So in that way, it was sort of like, well, it's not about me, it's that other person who's racist. So
It's interesting.
Let's see, can we get the mic over to the seat, and then we'll get to you next.
I have a question for Naomi. You said that social pain manifests in the same way as physical pain. So do you think it's possibly to eventually cure things like heartbreak?
sorry, what was the last part?
Do you think it's possible to eventually cure or alleviate things like heartbreak?
Could we cure heartbreak?
Yeah.
So, people often ask me this after I talk about the Tylenol study, like, oh, well, should we just sort of start prescribing painkillers for heartbreak? And I always get a little bit nervous about that because that was sort of to show this theory. It was to test a theory. So, the processes are similar, but I do think, I get nervous because I think that while these, negative social experiences are painful and they're not fun, they're also important. Like in some ways it's important that we know that, being rejected by somebody hurts so that we don't do it again. So I worry about completely obliterating that sensation and that experience. So.
Good. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for you. You said that if children are raised in an orphanage versus a parent, there's a big difference in the way the brain processes something painful or fearful. What if a child is raised partially like a nanny and then the parent comes home? Is there a big difference?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part?
What if a child is raised in a daycare for part of the day and then a nanny and then the parent comes home and gives it the same care that you had in your first group? Is there a substantial difference in their...
So you're asking basically whether children who experience brief separations, like having...
the bulk of the day. Let's say an average kid who goes to a daycare or is in the care of a nanny, and then there's a parent with the optimal interaction.
I think that that's still fundamentally different. So most of the evidence to date has suggested that children who go to daycare, as long as it's a high quality daycare, are virtually indistinguishable in the long run from children who are raised at home, whose parents are the primary caregiver at home all day, every day. So part of that's because they're still getting really good caregiving all the time. And part of that's because they're still also getting a lot of care time with their parents. Even if it's on weekends and at night, that's still a lot of hours in a week. The children who are in orphanage care for the first couple of years of life are really having an extremely unique and stressful experience in that it's typically anywhere from 6 to 12 infants alone, in each of them alone in a crib with one caregiver at a time taking care of them all. The caregivers change from day to day. They're paid and just have a fundamentally different experience with them, but one of the most disruptive things is just that they don't have the primary attention of any adult. And it's just I think there's something fundamentally different about having a parent who you maybe aren't with all the time versus not ever having a parent. So I think there's just a qualitative difference really between them. But it's a good question, and there certainly is some evidence that children who go to daycare earlier on might have a slightly more primed stress response early on in development, but it seems to level out within a few years so that then the kids really are not distinguishable.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is a general question. We're talking about brain plasticity and the fact that you can learn how to mitigate or change your responses and your behaviors. When will it be, and what has to occur in order for personal brain fitness management to become ubiquitous? Our kids could be learning it at a young age so they know, oh, I can, and so that it's taught. So like when I tell my kid, but I think that if it was just broadly accepted and understood, we'd all be much better off.
Does anyone want to comment on
I think if in terms of developmental influences on that kind of thing, the earlier the better. And it seems like a very good idea to learn these adaptive behaviors, these really positive influences on brain development could have very long-lasting changes on systems, on reward circuitry, on prefrontal cortex development. The sooner the better. It would take a policy change.
Just to follow up on that, good question, but how, and you were all fairly young, when is it that you see your research in the offices of clinical psychology and then used in society? You mentioned the juvenile justice system, but have any of you seen any of that happen in your research, and what is the general timeline that does transpire?
I can talk a little bit about it because we've actually been fortunate enough in terms of some of our studies of discrimination to have them be used in court cases. So, for example, one of the things to think about is when you're able to quantify how much does this impact a person? What is it that they are missing and cannot do? So part of it is the way you design the research and the questions that you try and answer. And again, that's why I say I try and answer them at the population level and make that answer such that what you can do with it is then try and go and advocate for change. So when you were asking us about, well, how can this happen? If you believe the results of our study, talk about it, share it. Ask your school system, we have this research. There are these UCLA professors that have given us this research. And ask the school to really think about, is there a way to integrate what we're learning into the curriculum. And so we give it to you, and it's really for you sometimes to carry the water and make the difference.
Are there changes in the brain that take a cheerful child and turn them into a moody adolescent? I guess I've struck a chord.
Hormones.
A child. Yes. Not looking forward to that. So it's interesting. Adolescence is a really amazing developmental period. I think it gets a bad rap because that can happen. But it's worth noting that, first of all, there's a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of how people navigate adolescence. And actually, most people, if they do ever go through that moody phase, come out of it all right. But because of all of the biological, I think this just got a little quiet. Because of all the biological, the brain changes, and the social changes that happen in adolescence, it's kind of no wonder that we should see some personality changes. And it's also, I think, worth remembering that the people who are going to deal with it or who are going to be faced with it the most are often parents, because one of the greatest tasks of adolescence is to start to realize you don't need your parents for the rest of your life. So yes, these things can happen during adolescence, but the good news is that actually, at least for parents, most adolescents report feeling closer to their parents by the end of adolescence. There starts to be this change. And my lab we recently just did a study where we had adolescents have to choose between giving money to their parents and their friends, and they choose mom on average over their friends, even though they say they like their friends more.
There's a question here in front.
Yeah, I just a little bit off what she was saying, which I think was a great question. I'm really interested in meditation and all those things, so I'm quite open to that. And I see the effects for me when I do it, but it's hard for a lot of people to buy into that stuff because there's not research. So, I've been told that in the next 10 years, like the biggest leap in science will be in the life sciences and what you're doing. So there's some research now. So what is it in what you guys do generally in the life sciences that you think, is it going to be technology? Is it going to be spreading knowledge to just take this research that you're doing and get it more out into the world, as you were asking, so that more people who would think some of this stuff is a bit woo-woo or unproven actually is real science fact, which I think will be a huge game changer for everybody and how to monitor our health and happiness. So I guess what would,
Janet, why don't you?
Yeah, well, I think this goes back to what Vicki said, which is the woo-woo stuff becomes a little bit less woo-woo when you can show that it's changing something in your body or it's changing your brain structure. So health psychologists do a lot of studies, for example, looking at if you intervene after someone gets a very terrible cancer diagnosis and help them with mindfulness, for example, or other sort of mind-body sort of interventions, well, then you see fewer cancer-related doctor visits afterwards. And so when you can show by integrating the body and the brain that what you're thinking and feeling actually could change something as important as cancer-related doctor visits, other researchers have shown tumor progression slows when you can tackle stress. These are sort of amazing findings that I think bring stuff out of the sort of fringe territory into the mainstream. And so you hear a lot about integrated care nowadays, and that I think is referring to traditional sort of biomedical models mixed with psychology and sort of quality of life, well-being all mixed together.
So we have time for one more question, if that's okay, Naomi. And then we got two? Okay, I got two mics out, so go ahead, and then the other person can.
We seem to live in an addictive society, whether it's prescription drugs, alcohol, eating disorders, whatever you want to say. And from a computer programming standpoint, you get stuck in what we used to call a do loop, which means you can't get out of the loop, right? You just go around in circles, beating yourselves to death. Do you see anything in the research that you're doing that would tell us there might be some new modes of getting people out of these loops and getting them back on a straight path?
I'd like to speak to that. My lab, one of the areas of research that my lab is involved in is in addiction research, and there's this concept that you just described. Perseveration is sort of that loop, the compulsivity loop. So there are behavioral addictions and there are substance addictions, but the brain doesn't really distinguish the two. So there are behaviors that can be addictive, just like people get addicted to substances. And so the research on it has a lot to do with neuroplasticity. There are certain behaviors that could enhance the tractability of those systems by engaging more control over behavior, by improving decision making. There are things like contingency management that have really been effective in having people be rewarded for positive behavior instead of sort of the stick. It's more the carrot and enhancing the incentives for sobriety, as an example, or just not engaging in that kind of behavior. So there are lots of very powerful behavioral modification techniques that show evidence in the brain that there are changes.
Comment on that, because what happens is when we take this actually into the healthcare field, what happens is that we're able to save costs, we're able to reduce visits. So taking some of this into places where we need to kind of sell it in the sense of you having improved health is exactly what causes the uptake.
All right, who's got the last question?
I do.
Okay, good. You've got the mic, so go ahead.
Thank you. My question is for the young lady who studies child psychology, and it's kind of like a two-pronged question. It's like nature versus nurture. You talk about, the kids in the orphanage and folks whose parents show signs of fear, mimicking that behavior and having that same kind of limbic response. And I'm wondering, is there any research as to how much of that might be chromosomally predisposed as opposed to learned behavior? And if it is in fact learned at a young age, is there any evidence that it's learned in the womb? Meaning, if there's a parent that secretes a lot of cortisol because they're constantly stressed out and have a very responsive limbic system, does that affect the fetus? And are they more predisposed to stress later on in life?
This is something I've been thinking about quite a bit as a pregnant woman on the tenure clock. So yes, we're learning more and more that prenatal exposure matters quite a bit for setting a person's trajectory, and actually even preconception factors can play a large role both in men and in women. So we're seeing that I'm actually starting a collaboration with some folks now starting to look at stress experienced during the prenatal window and what the long-term effects of that are on brain development. It seems as though really throughout development, we are going to be vulnerable to a host of environmental inputs. The good news is that we're more sensitive to both the good and the bad during the first couple of decades of life. And this is kind of the double-edged sword of neuroplasticity that's been brought up. So same way that when we look at adolescence and wonder, why is it that there's so much mental illness that seems to first set in during adolescence? There's also so many people developing skills that are going to buffer them against stressors and temptations for the rest of their lives. And it's because those brain circuits that are important for allowing you to regulate emotions and impulses are getting developed. It's the same reason for why that circuitry can go awry. So I think that yes, there is evidence that early exposure is going to shape trajectories, but in terms of having to separate out behavior or separate out nature and nurture, it's almost impossible. We can get at it in certain ways of maybe tipping the scale one way or another, but it's very difficult because often these things work in cyclical fashion. So if we see, for example, a woman who is anxious because of some genetic tendencies to be anxious, she's going to pass on those genes to her children while also demonstrating anxious behaviors. And to be able to separate out which of those factors is most important is very difficult. We can do it sometimes with twin studies, for example, for individuals who are separated early on in birth, although they still shared a prenatal environment, in which case you still can't take that out of the equation. But broadly speaking, I'd say what we tend to see is that environment matters the most when environment is extreme. So for example, kids who are growing up in extreme poverty, extreme cases of deprivation, environment is going to play a larger role. When you get to places of relative enrichment or privilege, you might start to see genetics playing a larger role. But that's just a coarse, broad statement.
So the bad news is you can really screw up your kids, but the good news is you can fix it.
Yeah, that's what I'm banking on.
Gosh, what an interesting topic. And I have to say for that, the next study that someone should take on is for that person that said, what happened with this wonderful adolescent that became such a naughty person? And you said it's to get them out of the house. And I want them to do a study of how to get them out of the house when they come back at 25.
You want them to separate.
So I'd like to thank Dean Victoria Sork, Naomi Eisenberger, Alicia Zerdo, Vicki Mays, Jennifer Silvers, Janet Tomiyama, and the guests for attending this evening. And for those of you that might be interested, our next Women in Philanthropy program will be June 20th. It's going to be a networking event with a panel of alumni sharing stories of success, lessons learned as a socially impactful business. So once again, thank you very much. I think our speakers are going to stick around a little bit. And so if you'd like to catch them and talk to them outside, by all means, please feel free to do so.